Hey, good afternoon, and welcome to this week's Iowa Learning Farms Conservation Webinar. I'm Matt Helmers at Iowa State University, Director of the Iowa Nutrient Research Center and faculty affiliate with the Iowa Learning Farms. And so if it's Wednesday at noon, it's time for another Learning Farms webinar, and I'm glad to be back to help host this week after missing last week. And this week, we are really fortunate to have a close colleague of mine. We've been fortunate to work together very closely since I started at Iowa State, but specifically over the last 10 years as uh, on various regional projects, from sustainable corn to transforming drainage. So Dr. Jane Frankenberger was the project lead for a regional transforming drainage project. And so Dr. Frankenberger is a professor at an extension agricultural engineer at Purdue University, and is going to talk to us about that, about working together across the Midwest to increase resiliency of drained agricultural land. With that, I will turn it over to Dr. Frankenberger. As always, if you have questions, feel free to type those in the chat box, and we will get those to Dr. Frankenberger at the end of our talk. With that, the virtual floor is all yours, Jane.
Thanks, Matt, and hello, everyone from Indiana, and thanks for inviting me to present to the Iowa Learning Farms webinar. I'm happy to talk about our Transforming Drainage project, which was a multi-state effort to manage water in our drained landscapes to increase resiliency. And we did this by advancing practices that store water in the landscape, some of which you'll see here, and I'll talk about more. Our logo at the bottom includes our tagline, "Managing Water for Tomorrow's Agriculture," which emphasizes how important these concepts are and will be in our changing climate. I also thought I'd include a poster from a field day to add to the atmosphere as I'm talking to you today. So I had the honor of leading this project over the last 6 years and working with a large team that was critical to our success. The project was funded by USDA NIFA and had a remarkable group of researchers, extension specialists, grad students, and formal collaborators from 13 universities and other organizations. I'd love to take time to thank all of them, but time obviously doesn't permit that, but you see a list here. The motivation for this project was addressing the fact that our vast drainage infrastructure was designed to get rid of water as quickly as possible. In conventional systems, there's almost no storage. In fact, making sure the water moves efficiently is a key objective of drainage design. And although there are advantages to getting rid of water as quickly as possible, it does lead to several issues. So first is the poor water quality from nutrients in the drainage water, also downstream flooding in some years, and also in some years, a lack of water later in the summer, like we're possibly seeing this year. Fortunately, though there are 3 issues, there is one solution that addresses all of them, and that's to store water in the landscape. So that's what we're trying to do to make drained lands more resilient in the face of our increasing extremes in the climate. But identifying ways to store that water is a challenge. And our project focused on 3 practices that can fit into a typical flat Midwestern landscape like this. So what we worked on include in the drainage system itself, we can install control drainage or drainage water management, which raises the water table when drainage is not needed. In a stream or ditch buffer, we can implement saturated buffers, which reroute water into the buffer for possible denitrification. And drainage water recycling stores water in a pond or reservoir for later use through irrigation. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time describing these. I was thinking that you've probably had webinars on all of them. I see a few, not so many. But anyway, what I'm going to talk about is what the Transforming Drainage Project did to advance these. So our goal was that when future drainage systems are designed, rather than just designing conventional drainage systems with no storage, like on the left, that these newer practices will be at least considered. And our vision, the reason we call it transforming drainage, is that our normal ways of implementing drainage will be transformed to include them. So the project, just a very rough overview, it included field research to better understand the practice impacts, synthesis and modeling to show the effects across the region and also under future climate scenarios, tools to allow the research to be more widely used, and then getting the results out to people who can use them. But what's perhaps unusual is really the fifth objective, which is that we really focused on building a network as well, not just to carry out our project, but to have a sustainable network to allow the work to continue now that it's finishing up. Now, I'm concerned that hearing about a project may not be the most interesting, so I decided to start by presenting the impacts. And I just thought of putting an image of a logic model here where when we do planning or evaluation, we start on the right side by thinking about impacts. So that's the idea, start with the impacts. So one of the impacts that I'm happiest about is the network that we contributed to creating. Now, part of this was the community of the project itself, as Matt mentioned. This has really allowed a lot of working together of scientists and engineers across states. So I'm illustrating that by showing the project website, and I'll come back to this because it's where a lot of our products are available. But we wanted to go beyond that, and many of us on the team worked hard to create a new organization called the Conservation Drainage Network. As you can see, the websites are similar, but this should continue well beyond the specific Transforming Drainage project. It came out of a few existing organizations that include a multi-state research committee, the Drainage Industry Organization, and a task force led by NRCS and ARS. But it is a new organization, and I wanted to emphasize it here because we hope it will continue well into the future. And I guess I didn't put the URL separately, but it's conservationdrainage.net. And I hope that many of the people on this webinar might consider being part of it. As you can see, we now have committees, and we're getting people engaged so that across the Midwest, and in fact, the entire US, well, actually in Canada also, people who are concerned and trying to implement these kind of practices can work together, can share ideas, and make it all more effective. So that's the first impact. Oops. Sorry, I forgot to advance that. So there we are. Okay, another impact that we're quite proud of is contributing to the revision of NRCS conservation practice standards, which are used as a basis, as many of you know, not only for the NRCS practices, but in many states also for other conservation programs. So to get these practices well accepted and implemented, we really needed the standards. So standard 447, which is called irrigation and drainage tailwater recovery, was revised to include drainage water recycling. And it's just getting adopted by state technical teams so that it could be used for cost share. The other one, the 604 saturated buffer, has existed for several years, but it's been updated with newer findings, some of which came out of this project. So as you all know, research and extension is important, but financial incentives and technical guidance are really important for getting the conservation implemented. So the standards will support, advancing these practices and increasing their use by landowners. Now I'm going to switch to talking about the products. And I thought, well, maybe I shouldn't call them all impacts, but we think that these will be valuable for many of you on this webinar, as well as project team members. Oh, shoot. I got the wrong version that doesn't have the videos in it. All right, I guess I'll have to go on without the videos. They're great videos. If we have time at the end, Matt, I'll come back and show the videos that I wanted to show just a few minutes out of them, but I don't want to take time here to do that. So we have two great videos, but I'll move on to the tools that we put another thing that we put a lot of effort into. And so here the idea was to take the research and deliver it through tools to help with decision making. So some of these inform, traditional drainage. It's not all just transformed drainage, but others provide design and site selection information for the new practices. So I'll show several here, and the URLs are displayed so you can go in and learn more. But I also, so the first one is the drain spacing tool by Asan Gane of Michigan State, and it allows a more quantitative basis for drain spacing, and users can use it to identify the optimum spacing for a given field and analyze how it changed based on factors like soils. The next one is called the Drainage Rate Calculator, and it's developed by Chris Hay at the Iowa Soybean Association. It calculates coefficients that are most clear to drainage engineers. Not all of you will want these, but they can be useful, and there hasn't been an easily accessible online tool before. So this helps design the intensity to be optimum for a given situation. Another one is the likely extent of agricultural drainage, which we developed here at Purdue. And it's one of a couple mapping tools that we have. This estimates what areas are likely to be drained. So it's, not flawless because it's just based on soils and cropping patterns, as many others have done. But what it's nice is it works really fast. You can zoom in to the level of a field as far in as is practical to use the Surgo soil data, and then out to the whole Midwest. And it also gives, it aggregates it by county or watershed or state. So we think a lot of people could use that, whether for proposals or just getting an idea of a certain area. I think that will be a very useful tool. And then we have two other mapping tools that identify areas where the conservation drainage practices are most suitable. So these are not to see what's already done, but what could be done, because very much, the sub-irrigation is not that much and the controlled drainage is not that much. So these are possibly for maybe contractors to approach farmers at areas that might be suitable, or for farmers or agency personnel to look up, specific areas. So they give us an idea of what fields might be the best candidate, how much area is located within a given area. You can look at it online, or you can download it if you are a GIS user. And then how does the potential suitability vary across the landscape? Another, a little bit more complex tool is the EDWARD, or Evaluating Drainage Water Recycling Decisions tool. And this helps us understand how large a reservoir would be needed to achieve irrigation and water quality benefits. So it's a it's a tool that allows us to ask questions to start getting an idea about how large of a reservoir we would need for this very new practice, because there aren't many implementations of drainage water recycling. It's hard to learn from example here. So we really need simulations as a tool to get an idea of whether this is practical at all in a given situation. And we're just putting together a video tutorial so that will make it easier to see how to use this in specific examples. And then there's a simpler tool, which is the nutrient loss app that calculates nutrient loss on your phone if you measure flow and concentration. So the 8 tools here are available on the website, but then we also produced an extension publication that we think is nicely laid out. Here's the front cover, Tools to Inform and Transform Drainage. And then for each tool, there's a page that explains how the tool can be used and by who. So this is one of quite a number of extension publications that we've got that hopefully would be helpful if you are interested in using any of these tools. It would be a good place to start, and also can be used in extension programming. So that's the tools. Then this is a general category, but I thought there's all kinds of other resources for extension and education that we have. Certainly, this was a part of our mission, and we have a number of products here. So one is the extension publications. So this is a way to make research results easily accessible to anyone, especially those who don't have access to publications actually on the web, at the journals. But also people who want it made more clear. So we have several that are in a question and answers based format. Here's one on drainage water recycling, saturated buffers, and then one that looks at the synthesis of corn yield response to drainage water recycling and this tools. And there's a couple more that are coming out soon. So we have all those. Then we have something called the Conservation Drainage Media Library, and it pulls together photos and illustrations, videos, and other media. And it already has quite a number of photos, and we would encourage you to go there if you need something for a presentation. They're all offered under a Creative Commons license, and the credit that it needs to be given will come out in a corner of the photo, so you don't even need to add that separately. It's got videos, and it's got a lot of photos, and I'll say it's also got these images. I was watching a presentation the other day and saw these images used by somebody completely different. So it occurred to me to mention that these images, which were created with considerable effort by members of the Transforming Drainage team, as well as a professional artist, might be useful to mention as something that can be used by others. So they're available on the website or in the Conservation Drainage Media Library. So in addition to these that I've already shown here today, there's a couple of drainage water recycling, which we just realized yesterday are not yet in the library, but we'll put them there. And so I just want to say, we had a good artist, but especially we had a lot of discussions. Some people on this webinar may remember of trying to figure out, which way should the tiles go, and how would you get into a main. This bottom one for drainage water recycling, we're putting both the type that needs a lift station, which many drainage water recycling implementations will need to have. So it would need a lift station into a pond, and this is subsurface irrigation or sub-irrigation. And on the other side, there's sprinkler irrigation and a site that didn't need a lift station and could be an embankment pond rather than an excavated and doesn't need a lift station. So we're trying to illustrate how many different ways that drainage water recycling can work. So that was a product of a lot of discussion, and we think they can be useful for others to use, and certainly to better understand the practices. Okay, so the largest aspect of the project I'm just coming to, and this is what I'll cover for most of the ending, that was the monitoring that took place at sites around the region. There are 39 sites in the database. I guess not all 39 were monitored as part of this project. Some were monitored earlier. But I'm going to end by describing the output of this field research, which besides peer-reviewed publication includes a unique and remarkable database that you can all access. So at each site, a treatment, one of these practices, was compared to a control without it. Now, because they started at all different times and with different funding, these were not all funded by the Transforming Drainage Project, we didn't follow the same protocols, but at each site, there were hundreds of field measurements. So we tried to coordinate those as much as possible. And then thousands of data points of concentration and flow along the way. So together, these were able to show the impact of the practices, because again, each site had a control compared to a treatment. So this research, all these sites generated many new understandings about the effect of the practices on reducing nutrient losses and on crop yield. But I especially want to mention that besides the individual site results, what having the project together allowed us to do was to develop several synthesis papers that have been published or in review. We've about 50 from the project so far. And many of these are open source, especially those that we think are of interest beyond the researchers who work in exactly this type of project. Many people have been asking these questions. What do we know from across the region about these practices? Now, that's the typical way to present research, but what's unique here is that all the researchers have provided the data they collected, and it's been put together in a publicly accessible database. So the data team at Iowa State managed making it into a functional, quality controlled database, a lot of quality control discussions and emails that includes the data. And then it's uploaded here to the USDA Ag Data Commons at the National Ag Library. And we think that this data is unique and uniquely useful in that it provides so much data. It can be used by scientists and engineers in future research, and I think that won't be the major use, but we also want to point out that it could be used by anyone interested in understanding drainage. Maybe you want to understand what free drainage looks like in Iowa compared to Ohio or something like that. Well, there's free drainage plots at each of these sites. So you would have the data that you could actually use to compare. So to understand the seasonality, understand about how much drainage comes out. So I think there's a lot of opportunities there. Besides being here, that's sort of the permanent archive. Oh, okay. The number of site years in the database. So to say a site year is, at one site, there's 39 sites times a year. They're split up this way. Here's the sites. There's also some that are none of the above. There's a couple of others. That's why it doesn't quite add up to 39. But crop yield has 101, 66, and 2. Not very important for saturated buffers, but very important for controlled drainage. And then drain flow being the major one. And this would always be drain flow at the control and the treatment. So there's 2 sets of drain flow that can be used. All right, now we'll say that besides the National Ag Library Ag Data Commons, the site that I just showed, there's also a site called drainagedata.com. I guess I cut off the URL here, but this is managed by Iowa State University, and it makes it easier for anyone to access the data because you don't have to download the whole database, just the data that you want. So we hope that this will, allow new understandings. So in addition to the data for each site, we've now got what I think is a beautiful site summary, thanks to Ben Reinhardt for that, from each site. So it provides a map that shows where was the controlled drainage and where was the conventional, for example. It talks about what data are available in the database. And then this is page 2. It gives a summary of the findings. So this one is the site I worked on, Indiana Randolph, also known as DPAC. But we talk about, over the 10 years of data, what was the effect on yield? We had a slight effect on yield and a, substantial effect on nitrate load and phosphorus load, which we had only 5 years of data. So that puts the summary together. Some are in metric units, some like this are in English units if we were primarily thinking of how people could use this in as an extension product. And then it links to all the published works from the site, and that gives anyone who wants to use it for research a way to link to much greater information about it. So now that we've got all this data up, I think it's really a very usable site for others to build on and to increase our knowledge of drainage. So the website provides access to all the outputs. Again, it's transformingdrainage.org. And we're still putting a few more things on there. The videos that hopefully, Matt, I can just show at the end, just to give you a quick view of them. I might do that if we have time. But it gives the database, more information on the practices, and many other resources. So that's certainly the place to go to find all these impact outputs. So again, in summary, the transformation of drainage systems to include water storage seems like it's critical to reduce the negative impacts and increase resiliency in the Mississippi Basin. I hesitate to use the word resiliency too much because the impacts of climate change are so dire that these can't fully replace the better precipitation patterns that we have now, but we can help with resiliency if we can add storage in the landscape. And this wonderful Transforming Drainage team has contributed to advancing these practices through the outputs I've described and the research data and the tools that we hope that people will use. And so that's why I wanted to focus on these tools and products today that we hope that everyone can benefit from in working with your audiences. I'm sure many of you are people who educate, as do many of us. And we think that they can be very useful in building the will, or the culture of conservation, as you folks say in the Iowa Learning Farms. So I will end there. And I guess I need to end with your CEU slide, right?
Yes, I will. If you want
my slide, if there's time, I'll leave that up for a while, because if we can't see the videos, I'll just tell you that they're fun videos. Go to the videos and watch them.
I think we have time for that, but I'll get the last two in here for the CCA. If you're on here and you need and want a CCA CEU, email Liz Ripley, ejukums@iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today with your name, that name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. So ejukums@iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today, 5 o'clock on July 6th. And then a plug for the webinar next week is the next slide, I believe. When I just forward, yep, okay. We have Dr. Castellano that's going to talk about nitrogen use efficiency and some new work that's going on around nitrogen use. So feel free to get on. And Jane, is William Frankenberger any relation?
He is not. And I never knew that Mike Castellano had his wonderful name there. No, he's not. But what a great name.
Great name. Yes. Okay. And before I forget, I want to put a plug in for if you're interested in drainage, like some of the rest of us, this August 30th, August 31st, and September 1st, come to Des Moines, Iowa. The 11th International Drainage Symposium will be held. If you just Google Drainage Symposium, you're going to find registration information at on the Soil and Water Conservation Society website. Please come. You'll hear presentations from around the country and really around the world about drainage design and management and thinking about environmental outcomes from those areas. So feel free to look for that and register for that. With that, Jane, if you want to show any of the videos, I think we can do that. We do have a couple questions, but
I'll just do it from the website. I think that'll be easier. So the first one, you'll see I talk about the.
Like all farmers, Joe knows the value of having a steady supply of water throughout the growing season. Not too much, not too little. But in recent years, he's noticed a change. Again this past season, a particularly wet spring was followed by an especially dry summer. And this pattern appears to be happening more often. To deal with too much water, Joe has invested in drainage systems that have helped ensure he can get the crop planted and fertilized. But when that thermometer starts to rise and the plants start to curl, Joe's beginning to wish he'd kept some of that water he drained away. But how would he store water?
I think the rest of the presentation that was going to come earlier, so that you learn how could he store water. Hopefully you've got some ideas about that. And then it goes on for another 2.5 minutes. But this one, I think you can use at presentations or even on Zoom ones. And then I'll just end with our whole set of videos that have come out fairly recently on drainage water recycling. I'll just start with this one, and so that you can just get a taste of it.
Drainage water recycling is the capture of water either in a pond, reservoir, or a drainage ditch, and then putting that water back on when we need irrigation or we have deficit water conditions. The main goal is to improve yield, but also there's a benefit when it comes to water quality as well.
Okay, I just wanted to touch on that so that you see that they really are professionally produced, and hopefully it can add to the audience, to our clientele's understanding of these practices.
Great. Thanks so much, Jane. We do have a couple questions, but if folks, still time to type some in, but we'll go to maybe the first one here. Have you seen any new collaborations or an increase in interest from many groups as a result of the Transforming Drainage project?
Oh, what a good, it's always hard to say exactly what's due to what, but I just hear this is very vague, but I think many of us feel like these questions come up more. The land improvement contractors, those people who install drainage, a lot more of them are at least thinking about these practices. Yes, we just have a farm in Indiana lately that's becoming more interested in this. So it's always hard to attribute a interest to a specific output, but I think that before the research, as I really want to say, is not new to our project. These practices had been developed before the project, but it's this coming together and trying to get it to be part of the conversation that we really think is a contribution. So when we see interest, we have to imagine that it's part of it. Drainage water recycling is probably the hardest one. That will require a very large investment, and I'm not surprised that we don't see it much before the cost share systems are in place, which as I said, many of our state NRCS technical committees are considering adding this for our states. But for something like that, that's such a big investment, you would need a number of funding streams. So we're more laying the groundwork, laying the foundation for that one, to have the practice in place that could be funded through NRCS, and then to try and get organizations, even cities, thinking about flood control, that maybe they could add to the funding for a practice like that, for flood storage or other ways that there might be an ability to pay for it. That's a good question, though.
I think I would add one, maybe a comment on that, is I think it's really helped us, the project has really helped us maybe bring together all that data to make kind of broader assessments of the performance of these practices that any one individual site doesn't allow us to do. So I think that synthesis has helped us, and then helped us when we go out and talk from an extension standpoint, that it's not just one site in one state, but this is what we've seen across the region that's been of benefit.
Yeah, thank you for adding that, and thanks for your leadership in one of the most important synthesis projects, Matt.
Right. We got a couple more questions here. So the first one, farmers seem to believe there's no downside to tile drainage. Are there some cases where adding tile may not be appropriate?
The tile drainage may not be what?
Appropriate.
Well, I suspect that tile drainage is going to become more widespread. I don't know, Matt, you can think about this too, right? But as we get more intensive rains, it's going to become a bigger problem for farmers to get the water off. And certainly in this part of the Corn Belt, especially, in most of it, we're getting more rainfall overall. Certainly in this part, we're getting strikingly more rainfall in the winter and spring, just when we don't want more rainfall. So I think, it's sort of not the time to talk about whether there can be where the drainage are important. I think people are going to put it in. It would be very hard to convince people for some reason to not install it when they are seeing the impacts of excess wetness in their fields. Obviously, the main reason they don't install it is if there's no outlet, and that's always a problem. So, but some are thinking more about pump drainage here where they hadn't traditionally thought of it. So I think that the communication that we're trying to do more is that think about what, not an addition exactly, but an enhancement or the conservation drainage rather than just drainage. So that would be where I would put the emphasis. You may feel you need to do drainage, and in fact, it would be hard to grow crops in a lot of our wet soils without them. But think about conservation at the same time.
Great. We did have. There's. We're getting some questions. That one. Okay. Next one, beyond funding, what other barriers to adoption do you see for these different transforming drainage practices?
Oh, that's a long question. I think there's just been a survey out to try and understand the various barriers. It's not a short answer. One is just, are you interested in doing it? For controlled drainage, it's time. So a big emphasis in the research there is thinking about automated the automated structures, which do exist now. Of course, they're more expensive, but they allow a person to, using your phone or some other app to move the outlet depth up or down. And that will certainly address one of the major barriers, which is the time, but, it's sort of a funding barrier as well. Some of the drainage water recycling, there's obviously a lot of barriers to getting a pond in place. We certainly recognize that. If you are excavating it, then you've got a lot of spoil to deal with, and maybe a lot of the ponds will be built up. You could use the spoil for embankments, and then you really will have to pump the drainage up into it, but that's a possibility. Otherwise, finding suitable locations will be very much of a challenge with that. Saturated buffers, not one I do much research on, but we have a problem in Indiana that our land is almost all, not all, but almost all so flat that it's hard to find a buffer that's down gradient of the field adequately that you could actually keep the buffer saturated during the growing season to make it really effective. So in fact, a lot of times the buffer is at a higher level than the field. So that's what I have thought is a very major barrier to thinking about saturated buffers.
All right. A comment that's come in from our colleague, Dr. Asan Ghani from Michigan State. See, this is the value of this network, is that he brought up a good point that try to avoid installing tile drainage in muck soils because it can cause considerable settling of that ground, thereby causing issues. So there's a case where it could decrease some of the productivity of that land.
Well, thank you, Asan. And we have to jump in that the main problem with muck soils is the amount of carbon release. So we really would hope that people are not draining muck soils these days. They have been drained in the past. That would be a very key place to use controlled drainage so that you're draining it as little as possible. I don't know if in other states they're draining the muck soils now, but certainly a greenhouse gas great concern.
There's a question up here. Any consideration of incorporating swales of the type pioneered by P.A. Yeomans in Australia for preserving water on the land under uneven moisture conditions like we are getting here in the Midwest?
I have never heard of that. And if that person wants to put some information in chat, I'm not seeing these questions in chat. Are they?
They're coming to me directly.
Okay, so, I see.
Yep.
That would be great to see the site, because I do, we all just have to put our thinking caps on, like, where could you store water? What can you do with swales? Where in the landscape would this work? Really, because there's no magic to storing water. You've got to have a place that it can be stored. And we have to think more strategically about how to use our landscape. So if that's a good idea that we can benefit from, I would love to hear it. I don't know if anyone else on this call knows about that. But certainly I've spent a lot of time thinking about, I don't know, whenever you drive down the highway and see the borrow pit from a new bridge, for example, could that be used for storage? But swales ditches, I think, are a real possibility. They've got all kinds of legal and social barriers there to using the ditches for storage, but there is a possibility that we need to be thinking about.
Here's one. Okay, store water in shallow aquifers.
That is a good one. We have not done research on it. Others have. I'm very supportive. I think that it's really important to think about, because it's the same idea that we need to store water during our more intense and heavy rains to have available during the drier, hotter summers that we are expecting. And the aquifers have many advantages, and I know in California and elsewhere they are studying how to store it in aquifers. So I think that's a great line of research.
Yeah, I think we'd have a lot of research there, I would think, to look at, what's the quality of that water we're putting in the shallow aquifer, where's the ultimate use of that. There's one more question. If tile drainage does increase, what additional incentives might be necessary to install it in ways that manage nutrient losses?
Sorry, can you repeat that again?
If tile drainage does increase, what additional incentives might be necessary to install it in ways that manage nutrient losses?
Okay, so the question is about the incentives. So that goes back to the barriers question, because, how to install it is either we don't want people to have it as intensive as it is, right? People are tending to make it more intense, putting the tiles closer together, but there's certainly less nutrient loss if they're wider spacing, or to install some kind of extra, edge of field practice. So whether the ones I've mentioned or bioreactors or others that can handle it. So that's what we're trying to get. So the incentives question, I'm not the expert here, but the one I understand best is money, the funding. And I think that our agencies, our cities, the way we think about it has to come together with multiple streams of funding is what I always think to make some of these work, that if they can enhance yield a little bit, drainage water recycling probably more in many situations, but being more expensive. But then the funding for the reduction in nutrients is also important. This is a good question. I've given talks on this and now they're not coming to me. Linda Prokopi, Jay Arbuckle, these people have studied a lot of what makes people adopt conservation. One I always like is the visibility, right? Things that are easier if you can see them. And so some of our drainage practices do not meet that one at all. You can't see that somebody's doing it. So I think that's a tough barrier. Also, I know that it's easier to get people to install practices that you can sort of try out with just something small. So like cover crops, you can just try a little. Again, the drainage in structures are a bigger investment. So it's harder for people to try that. But I think then we as society need to be very supportive of these efforts that some farmers are making.
Yeah, and it seems like through all of this and the need for future research, kind of looking at what are the economics of some of these practices and what could be done without incentives. Because as we think about the scale of change that's needed, it's unlikely that we would have all the dollars necessary to make the changes. And so looking for opportunities where there may be some of these practices may provide some economic benefits. It might not be everywhere with drainage water recycling, but there may be certain parts of the Corn Belt where incentives are less needed, and it almost may pay for itself.
So I've got a couple questions that came to me as
Right.
direct message. So is the chat
Good.
set so everybody's direct message?
Oh, it would be, since you're listed as a co-host, they
Okay.
probably could comment. If you have a couple questions and want to read those and answer those, that would be great.
Okay, so one person asked, what percentage of nutrients that go into a storage pond stay in the water when it gets reapplied to a crop field? This is what I think Matt has looked at a little bit and we've discussed. I think a reasonable default assumption is that it all stays there, that the pond is not really a treatment mechanism. So as a rough approximation, we can, especially if it's not a wetland, if it's, it's just a pond without a lot of vegetation, that it stays there. And then it's perfect, right? Because all the nutrients, the phosphorus and the nitrogen, are very valuable on the field. So if they stay there, it's fine. It can go back on the field. So we don't know for sure. There hasn't been enough research. And of course, it would depend on each pond, but we think that a high percentage would likely stay. Matt?
We are specifically monitoring 2 ponds, with a third pond starting to monitor probably here in the next week. To specifically look at that, what's happening to the nutrient levels as that water's in the pond, and then what is the nutrient levels if that water exits the pond with some type of downstream discharge.
Good. So we'll look for that information to come. Boy, this is a good question. I wish I had it in my head. Is there an estimate of cost per acre for controlled drainage and drainage water recycling? I should know these. These are really, really good questions. Matt, is anything coming to you? I've seen these, or does anybody else want to mention them?
Say that question again.
Is there an estimate of cost per acre for controlled drainage and drainage water recycling? We have worked on a spreadsheet tool. Obviously, it varies with every site. A lot of practices. Yeah, I'm not even going to speak on that one right now. Well, I guess I'm missing. I think that I do have a rough estimate, but not good enough to say. Sorry, we'll have to follow up, and that would be a good thing to have in future presentations. And then one person said Illinois is not mentioned. Why? And I would just say that was because the Illinois representatives were not at the meeting where we originally planned the project. We did have a funding in addition from EPA that allowed some of the Richard Cook to be a little bit more involved, and this is certainly missing. It's something that would be good to have Illinois more involved as well. We have several collaborators from Illinois as well.
I would say I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Jane, that when we started this project, also Laura Christensen hadn't gone to Illinois yet.
Yes,
so
that's right.
if she had been there in the beginning, she might have been involved, in addition to Richard coming in a little later too.
Yes, so true. And so this project is over, but again, I want to emphasize that the network continues. I guess this last slide, I went back to the transforming drainage, but certainly want to encourage anyone to get involved with the Conservation Drainage Network, which is really a remarkable group of people, all the people from transforming drainage and many, many more from the industry, from agencies, from researchers, teachers, and farmers could be, and so that we can continue to, write other proposals. I'm sure there will be other big projects that come out of that group to answer some of these pressing questions. By no means are they all answered, but we have. I think we know better what we know and what we don't know, and what are the opportunities for learning more.
All right. With that, Jane, thank you so much. Again, tune in next week for Iowa Learning Farms webinar for Dr. Mike Castellano. With that, I will stop the recording. I hope everybody has a great rest of the day.